Hello, and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I'm going to talk about adaptation, in particular, live action fantasy TV adaptation. The reason I want to do this is because the discourse around this is very, very fractious, and it's led to a lot of yelling on social media and people getting very annoyed and upset at shows and other people and calling each other names when none of this is necessary. But there are some key points to remember about modern fantasy TV adaptation that I think, in my opinion, are very relevant. And the first is, if we're going to criticize types of changes, then we're going to have to be honest about applying that evenly to everything. So, for instance, people complain about race swapping in TV adaptation, and they say this is wokeism gone mad, just like the boys did. But we like the boys, and they did race swapping. We complain about gender swapping in adaptation because this is wokeism and it's terrible. Where we take a male character and we replace it with a female character. How dare they do that? That disrespects the texts. Just like Peter Jackson did with The Fellowship of the Ring and the inclusion of Arwen instead of Glorfindel. We talk about how they have excised so much of the book material and then replaced it with their own scene that they have written, like some sort of fan fiction. Again, like Peter Jackson did with The Fellowship of the Ring. But they're not representing that character as being true to the book, like how Peter Jackson portrayed Gimli as the comic relief in The Fellowship of the Ring. Do you see how the type of change is actually the same across a bunch of different things? And it's whether or not we like it is generally the deciding factor over whether it is a good change, whether it is an acceptable change, whether it is something that you are allowed to do in adaptation, rather than recognizing, no, these are the things that happen in all adaptations. And our preference, our desire, our want, our need as book readers who love these things, that is skewing our perception of whether or not this is allowed. Because clearly, all adaptations do this. All adaptations, to a greater or lesser extent, remove characters, conflate characters, change characters. They remove scenes, they remove plot threads, they add in additional scenes, they change plot arcs, they change lore. They do all of these things. Sometimes we like it, sometimes we don't. But whether or not we like it or not does not change the fact that this is normal. This is accepted practice. This is standard. When we think about how much time we spend in these fantasy worlds, you can read a novel and 20 hours tops. Oh, I love this novel. I reread it 40 hours. I reread it again 60 hours. You spend 60 hours with that one novel. You love it. Then think of something like The Wheel of Time. And it's not 60 hours that you spend in this world. It's hundreds, if not thousands, of hours we spend in these worlds. We love them. We are immersed in them. And because of that, there's writing advice often given to writers, which is you need to be able to kill your darlings. When we love a text so much, we find it increasingly difficult to kill our darlings. When we are passingly familiar with a text, when we don't know a text, then we don't care. And so when we don't care what changes they make, we're evaluating what's on screen, not constantly looking for what they have changed. So even though the creator of these two types of shows, one that we know the source material and one that we don't, are making the same types of changes. They are going through the same process in order to produce a TV show for a specific audience, according to the specific requirements of whichever studio or broadcaster or network has commissioned the show. If we know the source material and love the source material, we go, that's bad. You're not allowed to do that. If we don't know, we go, oh no, but that's fine. It produced really good TV. That is all about the subjective perception. That is not an evaluation of whether or not the change was good. That's not whether or not the adaptation is good, because fidelity to text has not, is not, and never will be the deciding characteristic of an adaptation. You can have something like Starship Troopers, which in a lot of regards is incredibly faithful, at least narrative wise, to Heinlein's book. Almost all the same plot beats are there. Almost all the same characters are there. Yeah, there's a bit of race swapping, there's a bit of gender swapping, there's a bit of conflation of characters, but it is recognizable as Starship Troopers. In terms of tone, well, Verhoeven's film is clearly a satire. And if you read Heinlein's book as a straight endorsement, it's radically different. If you read Heinlein's book as ironic and a satire, then it matches Verhoeven's film. Verhoeven's film is a great adaptation. When we look at The Shining, a lot of the key events are the same, but Stephen King famously hated The Shining. In both of those, and of course I used Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings as an example. In those examples, that is a book to film, a single narrative unit to a single narrative unit. It's not even taking into consideration trying to translate something to a TV show, which is a different format. And again, we all know it's a different format. We all recognize it's a different format. We all know it's going to change how someone goes about things. Like, we're all aware of that. And of course, we take that awareness into consideration when we're evaluating it, don't we? Because take the Harry Dresden TV show. In around, what was it, 2007? The Sci-Fi Channel commissioned the Harry Dresden TV show. As part of that commission, they did a 2-hour telemovie, a double episode feature of an adaptation of Stormfront, the novel. And then the rest of the episodes were single events where Harry would investigate a case, much like side jobs, short stories. It was going to be episodic. But the plan from the beginning was, yes, have all of these episodic things, and then the big double episode, which was going to be the adaptation of the book. And you would think this is the sort of thing that book readers would love. Here we're going to have more Harry stories, more investigations, more fun things happening. And we're also getting the book on screen. Now, admittedly, it was a telemovie budget, not the highest budget. Before it aired, the Sci-Fi Channel decided, no, we don't want the double episode. We don't want this telemovie. Turn it into an hour long. That wasn't a writer decision. It wasn't a showrunner decision. That was a network decision. So, of course, we being fans take that into account when we criticize the episode that aired, I think, as episode 5. We take that into account. And we don't accuse the writers of being bad writers, because clearly anyone trying to take 2 hours of material and condense it to 1 and still have it be semi-coherent, you need to be an exceptional writer to make any of that work, because we know that narrative is interconnected. When we talk about fidelity to text, someone is bound to suggest, oh, here's the statistical model, here's the percentage of faithfulness that you'll have to have. And yet we know that's a ridiculous approach, because how do you determine the percentage change? Take the Dresden Files again. They had Harry in a different car, wasn't in the Blue Beetle. Is that a big change or a little change? What is the percentage value of that change? And do we take into account that the reason they didn't have Harry Dresden driving around in a classic VW Beetle was because it's a tiny car and Paul Blackthorne is 6'4". Now, Harry is obviously what, 6'8", in around 6'8". So in the book, yes, he does do that, and it's meant to be slightly ridiculous. But you don't have to deal with the physical constraints of someone getting in and out of a car in a book. You just say that they do it. Whereas someone who's 6'4" getting out of a classic VW Beetle is actually very, very awkward. I'm not that tall and I struggle because a friend of mine used to have one. So, what did the showrunners do? Well, in practical terms, you couldn't fit a camera in it to film the driving sequences. You couldn't fit all the sound equipment in. You could barely fit other people in. So, that limits a lot of what you can do using the car. So, it had to be changed. It had to be changed to a larger vehicle. Now, they could have wasted a huge amount of the budget and designed a giant SUV sized shell that looked like a VW Beetle, but it would have stood out like a sore thumb. It would have been ridiculous. It would have fixed Paul Blackthorne getting in and out, but it would have been expensive and looked silly because all of the other cars would now seem tiny compared to this giant VW Beetle. It would have been dumb. So what did they do? They changed it to a Jeep. Why a Jeep? They could have picked any car in the world, any vehicle in the world for Harry to drive if they're changing it from a VW Beetle. Why did they pick a Jeep? Because in essence, the Jeep is a mechanical vehicle. It doesn't have a lot of electronics and electrical equipment in it, just like the VW Beetle. Why is that important? Because the reason Harry drives the Beetle is because it is mechanical. It is easy to fix because his magic interferes with modern technology. So the showrunners, the writers, knew this. Not only did they know it, that he drove a VW Beetle, they knew the reason why he drove a VW Beetle. They understood why he drove a VW Beetle and therefore compromised and went, in order to cater to the practical types of filming, the necessity of the flexibility that we need for filming, and also to make it easy for the actor to physically get in and out of the vehicle, we made it a larger vehicle, but we made it of the same type. So how do you classify that change? Is that a big change? Is it a small change? It's certainly a superficial change, but it goes to the essence of the thing. And even with his hockey stick and drumstick that they had in the show instead of his staff and blasting rod, why did they change those things? Well, visually, they're trying to communicate that Harry is not your typical wizard. He doesn't walk around in robes. He doesn't wear the hat. Wait, the whole hat thing on the cover. Very amusing story. But he doesn't wear a wizard's hat. Yes, he has a staff. Yes, he has his blasting rod. But he's unconventional. He uses things in the modern day, like the little film canisters for a camera to collect potion ingredients. Why don't we incorporate that aspect of his personality into these things? It is modern day Chicago. It is a hockey town. So he can have a big hockey stick. It's a long stick, just like a staff, and it is disguised now because it has the hockey blade on it. It's still going to stick out. But in Chicago, in the modern day, it gets across that yes, he still has a staff, but it's unconventional. The blasting rod will make it a drumstick. It's roughly the same size and shape and does all of these things, but it gets across he's unconventional. It's visually straightforward. It presents a cohesive picture. They're all changes, but they're all superficial changes that still maintain the essence of the story. With Bob the Skull, they initially filmed a pilot of Bob the Skull just being Bob with little lights in it and this disembodied voice. The studio went, no, that doesn't work for us. And so they brought in an actor to play, instead of Bob the Skull, the spirit of intellect, Bob the Skull, the spirit. It's a two-word change, but that fixed a number of issues. Harry was no longer talking to a skull like he is Hamlet. Paul Blackthorne, the actor, had another actor to act with, to act opposite, to play off in scenes. It was more dynamic. It required fewer visual effects. All of these were very practical considerations. The character of Bob now still fulfilled exactly the same narrative functions. He was still Harry's tutor. He still had an encyclopedic knowledge of magic. He still had a complicated and interesting backstory. He still had all of those things, but they adapted it for the screen, for the practical considerations of TV. And that's what we're talking about here, that changes, we know changes have to be made. As book readers, we want to see as much of the original material on screen. But we are not the only audience. We are not the only people that the showrunners have to please. And even when someone makes an incredibly faithful adaptation, they cannot please all fans because our expectations are personal. Our line in the sand for fidelity is personal. These are shifting goalposts that every single person has. And you cannot please all of them. It is impossible. One of the most faithful modern fantasy adaptations is Neil Gaiman's The Sandman. Neil Gaiman, the writer creator of the original comic book, is involved in every aspect of this show. And it's taking something that, from an adaptation standpoint, is actually easier to adapt to screen than novels are because the visual medium of a comic book is made up of the visual information and, for the most part, speech. Exactly like TV, visual information and dialogue. That's a lot of what goes into TV. Does this mean that adapting a comic book to the screen is easy? No, it's not easy, but it is easier than adapting a 900 word or 900 page novel that is full of description and internal monologue and strange action sequences and lots of weaving plot threads and thousands of characters. That is more complicated than the episodic nature of individual issues of a comic book that is already storyboarding how you're going to do the adaptation. Doesn't make it easy, but in comparison to novels, it is easier. So Neil Gaiman, involved in every aspect of this adaptation, makes one of the closest, most faithful, most true live action renditions of his comic book. He knows these characters inside out. He's been involved in writing, directing, the casting. He was involved in all of these things. And still, there was fan outcry from certain fans. Not all fans, because no fandom ever speaks with a single voice. We all know this. In every fandom that we are part of, there are flame wars, there are factions, there are people who hate the thing that we love and love the thing that we hate. That's what fandom is. It's a giant, fractious, amorphous blob of all of these competing interests. But even in the Sandman fandom, where the creator, the writer, is involved in every aspect, accused Gaiman of not being faithful, of disrespecting the fans. Because their goalposts are entirely personal to them, their line in the sand. You change that thing, how dare you? And they ascribe intentionality to it. When it's just not true. Gaiman lovingly recreated his comic book to the screen. He gathered a group of exceptionally talented individuals to bring it to life. And any reasonable person can look at that adaptation and go, my God, that is brilliant. Look at how closely they paid attention to things. Oh, but what about the whole change with all of the superhero stuff? Oh, the things that he doesn't have rights to, or there are complicated rights to. That is a perfectly understandable, perfectly reasonable, perfectly rational, practical change. It is. And yet, people got annoyed. Fidelity to text is always going to be personal, but it's not the measure of good TV. It's not even the measure of good adaptation. Clueless. Clueless is a perfect example of this. Taking Emma, adapting it, changing the setting, the style, the tone, everything. It's a brilliant adaptation of Emma. It's one of the best adaptations of Emma. But it is radically different from the source material in a lot of superficial ways. But the essence of it is there. And that's the thing. Because we have spent hundreds, if not thousands of hours in these worlds, we have a very inflexible view of what the thing is. And yet, when it comes to something else, we can be much more flexible because our perception of the story hasn't solidified the way that it has for something that we have basically obsessed over. And the thing is, I'm a member of multiple fandoms. And we say silly things like, oh, well, if they did what the fans wanted, if they had more fans involved in it, if everyone was a fan, this would be so much better. Ask Doctor Who fans how that worked out. Doctor Who fandom is a perfect representation of this. They should pay attention to the fans. Which ones? Which is the best doctor? Depends on which fan that you ask. Which is the best companion? Depends on which doctor you ask, or which fan that you ask. Who was the best showrunner for Doctor Who? Well, it depends on which fan that you ask. Which is the best era? Which they should pay attention to the fans as if any fandom ever speaks with one voice. It doesn't. We know this. The other thing I want to touch on is this issue with blaming showrunners for things, blaming writers for things, and forgetting all of the other considerations. So, Game of Thrones, it was exceptional. It was an event. It caught lightning in a bottle. Who is trying to replicate that? Well, House of the Dragon is, understandably. But with Game of Thrones, other people want the same lightning in a bottle, but with very different properties. And when we start thinking about the differences between some of these fantasy properties, it becomes apparent they're not trying to replicate Game of Thrones. They're trying to replicate Game of Thrones' success. So, what made Game of Thrones successful? Well, for a start, Game of Thrones is pretty much a low fantasy world in that there's very little magic and supernatural elements to a lot of Game of Thrones, the TV show. Far fewer than there are in the books. But even in the books is not a high magic world. It's very pseudo medieval, very pseudo European. It leans into historical epic. And there's a long tradition of historical epics doing very, very well, both in the box office and on TV. HBO and BBC did Rome. Stars did Spartacus. We've had The Last Kingdom and Vikings, Marco Polo. We've had all of these historical epics or historical dramas. There's a big general audience for that. And Game of Thrones lent into that. The TV show adaptation skirted around a lot of the supernatural elements, hinted at them, used them tantalizingly. A, that helps reduce your special effects budget, which is a very practical consideration. But B, it allowed people to see it more as a pseudo medieval, historical kind of thing, historical epic, historical fiction. And that has a broader appeal than a lot of high fantasy worlds. It does. We know this. This is known. This is the way. And so, because of that, because the first 6 seasons of Game of Thrones were so successful, it kind of blinds us to certain realities. For a start, Benioff and Weiss wrote the vast majority of the first 6 seasons on their own. Yes, there were other writers. Yes, George R. R. Martin contributed scripts. But the vast majority of the writing in seasons 1 to 6, these award-winning, premiere, brilliant adaptations, were Benioff and Weiss. And they were fantastic. We loved them. It proved that they were really good writers, particularly when it came to adaptation. Then, when they reached the Gordian knot of all of these different characters, all of these different plot threads, without the resolution already pre-planned, did I call it a Gordian knot? Maybe I should have called it a Martinian knot, because even George R. R. Martin has not yet solved this problem. But they got to that point and they made a disastrous decision, a fundamental, foundational decision which caused massive problems. They went for a more plot-focused approach. They were trying to ram through all of these changes to bring things to a head. And because of that, it lost its feeling of decisions and actions flowing organically from characters. It became focused on a more mechanized sort of plot focus. That was disastrous, particularly in contrast to the preceding seasons. Is all the writing in season 7 and 8 bad? No. There are still some brilliant scenes, some brilliant moments. Even even some of the episodes, episode 2 of season 8, is still pretty damn good. So when we look at the entire project as a whole, it's clear Benioff and Weiss are great writers. They are great showrunners, but they are also human. They are also fallible, and they made a mistake, a disastrous mistake that was on screen for all of us to see. And yeah, it was bad. But in comparison to a lot of other TV shows, even season 7 and 8 are good. Compare season 7 and 8 to Legend of the Seeker, the Sword of Truth adaptation that was put on. There is no comparison. Even season 7 and 8 of Game of Thrones are better than Legend of the Seeker. They just are. Legend of the Seeker, a teen, family-friendly adaptation of Terry Goodkin's Sword of Truth. I would question that foundational decision, matching the source material to the audience, but that's what they decided to do. And you can see the DNA of Hercules, the Legendary Journeys, and Xena, Warrior Princess all over Legend of the Seeker. But in comparison to Hercules and Xena, Legend of the Seeker was even a step up. What we continue to see is this increase in quality, this increase in budget, this increase in attention to detail, this increase in fidelity to text. Lore consultants being employed by all of these big productions so that they have someone who has an encyclopedic knowledge of everything that happens. They understand the ramifications of changes right there in the room. Fantasy TV adaptations are getting better and better. And the changes in technology have been fabulous. Changes in visual effects, computer generated effects, backgrounds, green screen, all of this sort of stuff. That has had a huge impact in the quality of what can be adapted. Things that previously could never have been done, it just wasn't possible, are now suddenly possible, and we're getting to see on screen. But a bigger change is video on demand, not necessarily streaming, but video on demand in general. The idea of a back catalog that we can access at any time. The idea now that writers are no longer beholden to the episodic nature of broadcast TV has had a massive impact in terms of writing, because now they don't have to think of the monster of the week episode. They don't have to think of the serialized sort of nature of it, of this thing happens and this thing happens. We have to tie up every single episode that way. They can think of them as chapters building a narrative, building a season arc, building a series arc. That has been a huge sea change. And that is incredible. We are getting more and more of the books on screen. But still, there are pragmatic, practical constraints applied. We know this. We understand this. But sometimes when we think about, I know what live action fantasy adaptation is. We have a very narrow view because we think of the ones that we watch. But remember, Last Kingdom and Vikings, they aren't fantasy adaptations. They were historical epics. We mightn't think of True Blood as a live action fantasy adaptation because it was urban fantasy and paranormal romance, but it's clearly a fantasy adaptation. And again, deviated substantially from the books, race swap, gender swap characters, changed lore. It did all of those things. Brilliant adaptation, fantastic TV show, highly entertaining, particularly the first couple of seasons. It was great. We look at the new Anne Rice adaptation of The Vampire Lestat, and so much of that is far closer to the books than the film was that had Tom Cruise playing Lestat. Yeah, that was an interesting choice. Or Tom Cruise playing Reacher. Yeah, that's an interesting choice. But the new AMC adaptation of The Vampire Lestat is sumptuously, sensuously gothic. It's recreating the atmosphere, the tone, the style, the subtext, everything about those books. that's being recreated on the screen. Armand is far closer on the screen in that adaptation than he ever was in the film version. There are so many elements that are far closer to the books than we might give them credit for because there are a lot of superficial changes. But quite often, those superficial changes are like the VW Golf, or sorry, the VW Beetle in the Harry Dresden adaptation. It's superficial. It doesn't look the same, but at its heart, at its core, it is the same thing. It's just being expressed in a different way. So, just to give you an idea of how varied modern fantasy adaptation is, I'm going to read out a list of fantasy adaptations from 2011. Camelot, Game of Thrones, Teen Wolf, Once Upon a Time, House of Anubis, Grimm, Beauty and the Beast, Labyrinth, The Return, Sinbad, Witches of East End, Sleepy Hollow, Once Upon a Time in Wonderland, Outlander, Constantine, Resurrection, Bitten, The Magicians, Lucifer, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, The Shannara Chronicles, Shadowhunters, Winona Earp, Preacher, Van Helsing, Beowulf Returned to the Shieldlands, American Gods, Lemony Snicket's Series of Unfortunate Events, The Worst Witch, A Discovery of Witches, Titans, Charmed, Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, Troy Fall of a City, The Protector, Good Omens, His Dark Materials, The Witcher, Miracle Workers, Cursed, Lock and Key, The Letter for the King, Warrior Nun, Lovecraft Country, Dracula, Wheel of Time, Shadow and Bone, Sweet Tooth, Fate, The Winx Saga, The Watch, Rings of Power, Vampire Academy, The Sandman, Interview with the Vampire, House of the Dragon, Reginald the Vampire, Wednesday, The Bastard Son and the Devil Himself, Willow, The Winter King, Lockwood and Co., Mayfair Witches. So that's about 60 live action fantasy TV adaptations. They range from short seasons to longer seasons. They range in terms of audience from children's to adult. They range in tone from comedic to romantic to epic and violent. Fantasy is hugely broad. And we know that fans of the specific work that the adaptation is based on are always going to have problems with that adaptation because it's not the books, because we are book readers. That's our bias. That's where we stand. But these shows include us in a general audience. They try their best to include things that please the fans, as well as work for a general audience. Yes, we would love things to be catered directly to us, to only do the things that we want. But as I've tried to point out, that's impossible. You cannot please all fans, let alone all members of an audience. You literally cannot please all fans, even when they love the text. It's just not possible. But you can see how the type of network, the type of show, the intended audience for the show, all of these things change the type of show that ends up being produced. Fidelity. We might want more fidelity. It might be aspirational to have more fidelity. But that is not the reality. That is not the norm. That is not, has not, and never will be the deciding factor, particularly for a general audience. If fidelity was so important, then we would hate all adaptations that stray from the source material, regardless of whether or not we knew about the fidelity. Because if fidelity to source material is the defining characteristic, any adaptation that strays from source material will be bad. We won't like it. We don't need to know the source material, because if it's the thing itself that causes it to be bad, our knowledge of the thing itself is not relevant. If, however, our knowledge of the source material is causing us to think the thing is bad, that has to do with our ability to be flexible in how we perceive narrative. And the fact that we care so much about source material that we think of it in only one way, and this is the only way to tell this story, that is on us as fans. That is not the adaptation's fault. And that is a very hard pill to swallow. Because really, our expectations, our preferences, our desires, and our inability to see a different form of the same story, that is always on us, all of us. And depending on how invested we are in the source material, whichever source material it is, that affects it. There are some we're going to care about more than others. There are some it's easier to let go of than others. But that's the essence. That is at the heart of all of this. It's not really the showrunners or the show or what they are doing that is the problem. Quite often, at the heart of the problem of all of this is us. And I include myself in that. I am not saying this is other people. It's me. It's you. It's all of us because we struggle with this. Adaptation will always say things like based on, inspired by, a film version of. It's never trying to be the thing because it can't. It can never be. Film to novel, uh, novelizations of films, novelizations of TV shows show us that as book readers, we are almost always going to prefer those because they are just going to be better. They're going to be more immersive. They're going to have more detail. They're going to have all of those things. The things that we love because we're book readers. A cinemaphile might love The Lord of the Rings by Peter Jackson, Peter Jackson's version of The Lord of the Rings. A cinemaphile might love that, but because they're not a book reader, they'll look at the Fellowship and think, "Oh, the pacing in this is terrible. Oh, it's awful." We have to account for our bias in our discussions. But anyway, I've talked about this long enough, and I hope that everyone understands this is about trying to understand. It's not me telling people off. I am a fan just as much as other people are. I struggle with this too. But thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.